Hello and welcome to Michigan Opera Theater's In Conversation. My name is Andrea Scobie and I'm the Director of Education with Michigan Opera Theater. And today it is my great pleasure to be joined by four illustrious guests who will join me in a conversation about the arts and their capacity to aid in wellness and healing. As we live through times of crisis, both globally and personally, we know that music, dance, theater, and more offer opportunities for connectedness and catharsis. And today my guests will speak to the relationship between creative arts and physical and mental health outcomes. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Gomez of Wayne State University, Dr. Jessica Lopez Lyman of the University of Minnesota, Dr. Sara Ramirez from Texas State University, and Mr. Brooklyn Mack, International Principal Guest Artist, currently dancing with English National Ballet. Welcome to each of you, and thank you so much for joining me today. So you each come to this conversation bringing a different perspective and a different area of expertise. And I'm hoping to begin, each of you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Hi, my name is Sara Ramirez, and I am an assistant professor of English, specifically Chicanx literature at Texas State University in San Marcos. My degree is in comparative ethnic studies, and the manuscript that I'm working on deals with a concept that I'm developing called subjects of trauma. My research includes Anzalduan thought, so focus on the philosopher Gloria Anzaldúa, theories of Chicanx self-making, Chicanx representations of trauma, as well as feminist editorial practices. I'm also the co-publisher for Third Woman Press, Feminists of Color Publishing, and I've co-edited and written introductions for the last two volumes of an Anzalduan text called El Mundo Zurdo, also published in Diálogo, and I'm, like I mentioned, currently at work on my first book manuscript that focuses on historical and intergenerational traumas that are experienced by Chicanxes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gomez.
I'm Jennifer Gomez. I have my PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Oregon, and I'm an assistant professor at Wayne State University in the Department of Psychology, as well as MIPSI, which is the Merrill Palmer Stillman Institute for Child and Family Development. I'm also a board member and research chair at the Center for Institutional Courage. And then I have upcoming journal coming out from Journal of Trauma and Dissociation, a special issue on discrimination, violence, and healing in marginalized communities. And relevant for today, I'm a former ballet dancer with Dance Suite of Harlem, and now a lover and patron of the arts, and then a professor here.
Thank you. Dr. Lopez Lyman.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Lopez Lyman. I'm coming to you from Minnesota. I am on the homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota people. I am a Chicana feminist scholar, as well as an interdisciplinary performance artist. I got my PhD in Chicano Studies at UC Santa Barbara. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, and I'm really excited about this conversation today, both as an artist and a scholar. I'm really interested in how we can create alternative spaces, how we cultivate our radical imagination in order to create systemic change. Right now I'm working on my first book, which looks at Latina cultural organizers in the Twin Cities, specifically around contemporary social movements that have to do with environmental justice, like Line 3, which I'll be talking about a little later, as well as Black Lives Matter. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Mack.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brooklyn Mack. I'm an international principal guest artist. I'm coming to you from South Carolina at the moment. I've danced all over the world in many of the world's biggest and greatest theaters, including the Bolshoi, Paris Opera Ballet, London Coliseum, Covent Garden, and New York's Metropolitan Opera. I've been dancing for about 16 years professionally now. I have been a freelance artist for the past 2.5 years. I'm very excited to be on this panel and speak with you all about the arts and healing.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to hear each of your perspectives. Each of your experience brings so much to this topic. And I think with that, let's just jump right in. Dr. Gomez, I'd like to start with you. Your work specifically centers on trauma and inequality, particularly within marginalized communities. And after the year of 2020, with both the COVID-19 pandemic and anti-Black violence getting more public attention, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the effects of both trauma and inequality on individuals and communities.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So I'll give us the bad news, and then the rest of our time will be happier healing stuff. Racism and racial trauma in particular, and anti-Black violence. So we know that it's toxic to health, right? And even though anti-Black violence isn't anything new and racism isn't new, the increased attention in the media means that we're exposed to this vicarious trauma, violence. And so this is linked with mental health stuff like depression, PTSD, thoughts of suicide, internalized prejudice, a whole host of things, as well as things like cardiovascular disease burden, and so on, lots and lots of different things. Part of what happened in 2020 for lots of us is this increase in tension really helped us to see the way racism manifests in our everyday lives, at least for me. And so something as easy as going to the doctor's office and having my Wayne State mask on, and the doctor says like, "Oh, are you a student at Wayne State?" You know, I could be a student at Wayne State. I also could be a professor, and the assumption that I would have to be a student then is racial and gendered, and those microaggressions that happen all the time kind of wears at our mental and physical health. Adding in specifically with what I look at, so I've developed cultural betrayal trauma theory, and the idea here is that within this backdrop of anti-Black racism, police brutality, like on film, in public, with immunity, means that for some Black people, for instance, develop this solidarity, what I call intercultural trust. And this is really positive, right, against all of this terrible oppression and violence. And the problem is when violence, sexual abuse happens within the community, within Black people, then it violates that intercultural trust that's so needed. And so it's this cultural betrayal. And so then this within group violence or cultural betrayal traumas that I predict, and the research to date has shown, is linked with things like depression, PTSD, all of those terrible things that we think about, anxiety, right? All this stuff, as well as other things that we don't always think about, like internalized prejudice. Like if this is a part of what being Black is, then I don't want any part of it. And we can see how this anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism, which is also telling you it's not good to be Black, then the within group violence, cultural betrayal trauma is telling you the same thing, and then is really toxic to your mental and physical health. And so that's the bad news. And then how this interfaces with COVID as well, right, in the health disparities. And if we're thinking that racism and violence, according to literature, predicts things like asthma problems, cardiovascular health, things that also make you much more susceptible to worse outcomes of COVID. And then you match that with the healthcare system that is racist and not treating you properly, then you see all these really big effects for mental and physical health. That's the bad news. But I think that's also why the arts are so helpful and so needed. We can be healing even while we're still under attack in these ways from racism in the US.
Thank you so much for offering that background. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Lopez Lyman, your work touches on trauma as well, but it really centers on the way in which the arts are uniquely situated to offer hope and healing. How have you both seen engagement with music, theater, literature, and or visual arts lead to some of this healing and some of these better outcomes for all of us who are engaged in dealing with trauma in our lives?
So I'm going to start with two stories. The first is about my hometown of Minneapolis, where I'm currently at. Many of us probably heard of the murder of George Floyd, which not only created local, state attention, international attention, but international attention. My home was 6 blocks from where Mr. Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. What we know in Minneapolis, though, is that this is not the first time of police brutality. As Dr. Gomez has shared, right, this is a systemic structural problem when we're looking at the police state. But what wasn't seen once the news media left was how artists were central for organizing. And so one of the things that I look at in my research is this idea of cultural organizers. Cultural organizers essentially is the intersection between art and activism. In Chicana feminist thought, we call this artivistas. For example, Felicia Montes or Marta Gonzalez in Los Angeles use this term to describe how they bring art as a form of healing, as a form of activism to create systemic change. And so one of the fantastic groups that came out of the tragedy of Mr. Floyd's murder was a collective of multiracial people called Creatives After Curfew. Like many states, many cities that were put on curfew during the uprisings against anti-Black racism in the police state, Minneapolis had this group, Creatives After Curfew, and they defied the governor's orders, and they went out around the city and painted these gorgeous murals. They also made sure to center Black voices and Black artists, because part of the healing, we can say, is spiritual, is embodied, but it also means that our material resources, what we need to survive, is taken care of. And so by centering Black artists, this collective made sure that resources, including monetary resources, were given to artists. The second story I want to share is about Line 3. Currently, Enbridge's pipeline from Canada is going through 1/5 of the world's fresh water, which happens to be in northern Minnesota on Anishinaabe land. And what we see here is this beautiful network of folks of color and Native folks coming together to use art as organizing. Particularly one of the things I write about is this tour, hip hop tour called Balance the Nations, which included artists like Maria Isa, Natani Means, Tufa One, Muja Messiah. So we have Black, Native, and Latinx folks coming together in what Betta Simoke Simpson would talk about as constellations of co-resistance, right? Folks intentionally using creative production to figure out how to create alternatives for a more just world.
Awesome. I just love the work that Jessica is doing. I do focus on trauma itself in relationship to literature, the visual arts, and performance specifically. And I do see more of the visual arts and performance arts as something that can be more public and more collective that we can engage with. And so what I've done in my manuscript, or what I'm doing, is exploring the ways in which theater spaces, for example, may help the audience itself to heal. There's one performance in particular that I've studied, and it's called Las Hociconas by Adelina Anthony. She performed this, I think, like circa 2011 in the Bay Area, and she asked audience members to go back to La Peña, the cultural center there in Berkeley, over the course of 3 nights. And so each night we had the same audience return. And for me, her work, Las Hociconas, is a one-woman show, and she moves from characters like La Sad Girl to La Hocicona, and she really asks the audience to engage with her. And so she brings the audience into her performance, and we're all laughing at the same time and feeling oohs and ahs, right, at different times. And I think that in those moments, we can actually study like the psychobiology of it, that people's like chemical and electrical connections really come together and start to reorganize in ways that can help us heal. And so I'm really interested in just energy and interconnection. Like that's my thing. There's also, of course, visual art. I recently learned about an artist. Her name is Andrea Munoz Martinez, who does what seems like grids. Actually, let me get to this. And they look like this. Each of these lines allow her to meditate, and she explains that each dot has its own energy, and she just meditates with these pieces. When she gave me this, she explained to me, she's like, look, I actually painted it like this, and this is where the paint dripped off, and you can feel this. And she was it was so tangible, right, to hold this piece and to witness this piece with her, that I start to see how this piece actually carries its own emotion, right? So that it's not devoid of emotion, as is a lot of Western art in museums, right? That it's just there for observation and not to be felt. And when I showed my sister another painting that I was considering buying from her, she said, no, don't get that one. what makes me anxious? Like that's not. And so I explained to Andrea that one made my sister anxious, and she said, this has to do with anxiety. And they're not just, but they're grids, right? How do grids convey emotion? I truly believe that they have their own spirit and their own energy that can help us heal.
Thank you for that. You know, what you were saying about being together in the theater space reminds me of a study that I wish I could quote it firsthand, but I remember reading that in musical performances, audience members sitting beside each other, their heartbeats start to synchronize. And I think that that's just the most beautiful distillation of what the arts do in coming together in, to view performance. And I just love that. That's what that reminded me of. Talking about viewing performance, I want to hear from also an artist who gives a performance. Mr. Mack is a professional ballet dancer yourself. I'm hoping you can speak to how you've experienced the arts broadly and dance specifically as a place of healing for yourself and for others.
I can speak to it actually very recently, personally for myself. Obviously, 2020, this last year, was very difficult for the world as a whole, and I was not unique in that experience, but I had some very traumatic experiences within this last year in losing friends. One close friend in particular, who also happened to be a dancer. He didn't die because of the pandemic, but he died in the midst of it in a fatal car accident. It was actually right as the pandemic really started to break out in March of last year. I realized a few months later, as I was beginning to come out of the depression I fell into after losing this friend, that the reason that it was so very difficult for me to overcome that grief was that I didn't have dance. I didn't have my outlet. I didn't have that artistic expression that I usually would turn to, whether I knew it or not, as a place of solace, as a place of relief and healing. I realized that the studio was very much a sanctuary for me, just as performing on stage was also a type of sanctuary, but also a great release. And with the absence of those things and those tools, I would say, it became extremely difficult to process my grief and process things that sometimes words don't do justice to. That's a recent trauma. And also that was, of course, amplified by the things that were going on at the time as far as anti-Black lives movements and increased attention on police violence and the inequalities. All of those things amplified the grief and anxiety and different emotions that I was dealing with. It wasn't until that I was able to come back to dance, come back to the arts, that I was able to really start to process and heal myself.
Thank you for sharing so personally and so deeply. I really appreciate you opening up in that way. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I want to throw the question out to anyone who would like to answer. Just a broad question about what are some of the greatest lessons you've learned about the healing power of the arts?
I can say something briefly and then defer to the still artists, the people who still do it. When I was with Dance Studio Harlem, I performed Balm in Gilead, which was a solo choreographed by Arthur Mitchell and performed previously by Alicia Graff, who was a big prima ballerina with Dance Studio Harlem. And it was very intimidating to try to perform it after she had, when I got past that and all those things that don't really matter, Balm in Gilead was this gorgeous piece and a hymn, like sung in a hymn. And I created an entire story for myself of what it meant, what it would mean. Most of it was done on a piano bench and very like long, stretchful movements. And when I perform it, I would see audience members. I could actually see them, and there'd be tears in their eyes, tears in my eyes. And I remember Mr. Mitchell always saying, and Brooklyn will know this too, of be the music. Don't be on the music, be the music. And I didn't learn what that meant until this piece, where every one of my gestures was the music, and the music was me. And I think the experience of being able to perform that, and you were mentioning, Andrea, about the heartbeats being in sync, as an artist, having the audience members be in sync with the emotions, and emotions that you aren't putting words to, but that are kind of larger than words, is so powerful. And that transactional process in the arts between artist and audience member is a real gift, and very healing on both sides, I would argue.
And one of the greatest lessons I take away from art in terms of healing is this phrase, la cultura cura, meaning that art cures. I know Sara writes about this a lot in her work as well. But when we think about our societies prior to colonization, prior to the invasion of Europeans, we didn't have this bifurcation between the arts and the sciences, like we have structurally set up today, I think, in the academy, but also in our society, right? How we privilege certain types of scientific knowing, but there's also this aesthetic knowing that's created that I think we've already been talking a lot about today in terms of healing, whether it's energetic or whether it's a form of grief, and healing from grief. And so I think about this idea of art as cure, or culture curing. And for me as an artist, I do performance work, installation work. I like to really disrupt space, so a lot of kind of guerrilla theater. I also recently started doing printmaking. And I'm not trained. I don't have an MFA. I've never taken a visual art class, but there was something about the release of having to process through my mind and really get into the embodiment of this work, which I think is why I love performance so much. But as screen printing, there's this ritual of repetition. I recently just did a series of 4 different commissioned postcards that were put in this box called the Community Supported Art, kind of a play off of Community Supported Agriculture. And folks were able to buy these art boxes, and then they were sent across the country as a way to connect during the pandemic. But as I was making these postcards, every time you do a screen print, one color in an image is one screen. And so I'd have a postcard with multiple colors, which meant multiple times you'd have to pull the screen. And I, had to make 200 postcards. So there was this very repetitive motion. I also, severely sore the next day from using muscles I don't typically use on a daily basis. But I think that meditative ritual of creating art really helps you disconnect from this like capitalist driven society where we're constantly having to produce in a particular way. And all of this is an embodied experience. And so I think whether we're looking at, the beautiful work that Sara just showed us, or here I have a rebozo that was made in Oaxaca that I used during my child's recent birth, right? Each of these threads is a prayer, is an intention. And we see this through cultures around the world with beadwork or tapestry. And so again, I think coming back to this idea that our cure, we've always known as Indigenous people, as folks of color. And so returning to that through the arts is a really great vehicle to come back into that embodied ritual.
Absolutely.
Just to go off of that idea of la cultura cura, right? Culture cures. My work questions, what are we curing, right? And as Jessica has explained, right, it is the violence upon our communities, right? That a lot of, at least Chicanx art, and I think a lot of other marginalized groups' arts do, is address, right, the violence and oppression that our communities experience daily. And in order and cure it in some sort of way. At the same time that we're reflecting on healing here, I can't help but to think about another artist's work, Virginia Grice, who has a performance manifesto titled "Your Healing is Killing Me." And we're asking, right, what is healing? And so in her manifesto, she really breaks down what healing is. She says that the book is a manifesto toward a politics of collective self-defense instead of individualized self-care, right? And then she follows that up with, the revolution is not in your body butter, right? And so it's this really profound moment, right? When we start to think about what is healing? What is healing? And at least for me, and I think that for most of us or all of us on this panel, we understand that healing is a process toward wholeness, right? In the face of oppression. And what is wholeness, right? How do we get there? How do we get to wholeness? What makes us whole beings? In Mexicana and Chicana culture, we think of susto, which is an illness that refers to the frightening of one's soul out of your body, right? It's a trauma that you experience. It could happen in a car wreck. It could happen by someone just frightening you. It could happen by getting a phone call at 3 a.m, right? That your son has been shot. So that susto, right, is something that that we want to address. How do we call the soul back into the body, right? How do we take care of the soul in this healing process, right? Does the body butter heal that, right? Or is it going to be something else, like the arts that can tap into the soul, right? That can help us heal.
I guess the greatest lesson that I've learned from the arts would be the transcendence that the power of transcendence that the arts have. And I would see it more and more every time that I would travel and go somewhere, some other country where the narrative was that we're, worlds apart, so different, at least the narrative in society and on TV. And no matter how many differences that we, are perceived, once we were able to connect through the arts, connect through music, connect through dance, connect through painting. No matter where you go, these things exist in every culture. And for as far back in time as we want to go, there's always music, dancing, painting, these rituals. And I think I've always thought that that's because these things are central to us as human beings. And without these things, that we would really cease to be humans. As long as we're open, we're able to connect to anyone, anywhere. So that's definitely the biggest lesson that I've learned from the arts.
Would you talk about Petrushka and like the revisioning of Petrushka?
Well, yes, the first performance that I've done since the pandemic started was Petrushka. It was, of course, virtual. This was a new vision of Petrushka. Petrushka, I don't know if any of you know, was a ballet that was created for the Ballet Russe. And originally, there's 3 characters. There's Petrushka, who's a sad, pretty melancholic clown. There's a ballerina doll. They're all puppets, by the way. It's a ballerina doll. And there's a Moor. The Moor, of course, was originally done with blackface and also was a very violent and portrayed as, well, besides violent, also portrayed as, not having a lot going on upstairs.
Sorry, Brooklyn, as of like 2005, they were doing blackface. Like I saw in New York City, Petrushka being performed in blackface.
In New
That
York?
was the tradition. Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow. So, yeah, so that's in the ballet, the story anyway. The Moor, I guess, is involved with the ballerina doll, and Petrushka is in love with the ballerina doll, but his love is unrequited. And he dances his heart out for her love. But in the revisioning, obviously there's no blackface. And Jennifer Weber was the choreographer. In the recent years, she's been doing hip hop and ballet fusion. So she had an idea to revamp Petrushka and tell a story that could actually be told today without drastically offending Black people. So the Moor is, rather than just a foolhardy, violent person, even though he's a doll, he has more of a soul in him, and he loves the ballerina doll, but his expression of love is a little more brazen than Petrushka, who also loves her, but his expression is just, I guess, in a much softer, more meek way. It's just a more full story and basically a more complete vision of the characters.
We as arts practitioners need to examine those traditions that are harmful to communities. Arts can't be a place for healing if the arts are continuing to perpetuate stereotype and harm. So I'm very glad to have this conversation, to know that a piece like Petrushka can continue to have life, right? I mean, our canon is important to us, but how do we reinvent our canon to make sure that arts continue to be a place of healing and of sanctuary? And I think that's part of what is incumbent on us who are artists, who work at arts organizations, to continue having those conversations.
And I also think it's like the responsibility of us as audience, as witness, to also push our institutions, particularly when we're looking at foundations. There's so much great literature that looks at the nonprofit industrial complex, particularly in the arts, and how arts funding is allocated. And I think that, Jennifer and Brooklyn, the example you gave takes courage for a choreographer to imagine or for a dancer to perform. But I think at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the audience to demand more of the institutions to change. And not hide behind this quote unquote tradition, which is a tradition of white supremacy. And I think it's also our responsibility as an audience to push foundations to shift the way that resources are allocated so that we can have not just these re-envisionings of a story like this dance performance, but that we also have resources to tell the plethora of stories we have in our communities that continuously are not told because they don't fit particular stereotype or don't, confine to this box of the imaginary of what they perceive Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be.
And I think that move, as Andrea was saying, that move from taking an offensive piece like Petrushka and revisioning it to make it whole, right, is in itself a process of healing, right, for not only the performer, but the audience as well, right, to see it humanized in a different way, especially this character of the Moor. And a lot of Chicanx feminist literature does that with myth, right, especially like the myth of La Llorona, right, the wailing woman who drowned her kid, right, but it's this very patriarchal story. So how do we go back and revise that story so that we can understand the wailing woman's, La Llorona's motivations, right, in drowning her children? And so there's lots of revisioning around that.
As we come to our conclusion, I want to ask each of you to think about what are the long-term benefits of engaging in the arts during difficult times, whether it's this difficult time we find ourselves in, a time of pandemic, a time of examining violence that we see happening in our world, in our communities, whether as audience or creators, whether we're in our home or in the theater. What are the benefits that we'll see in 10 years? If we really took creative engagement seriously at this time, where do you think we would be?
Trauma and harm that I study some of them are discrete, but many of them are long lasting, like racism is long lasting and sexual abuse happens over and over and over again for so long. And so what I'm thinking in terms of examples are ballets that I've seen that still touch me so deeply, like Spartacus, so classic Spartacus with Carlos Acosta performing it, big international Afro-Cuban artist in Bolshoi, and an opening scene where he's just been in prison and just has the shackles on him. And he is like coming to the realization of what it means to be enslaved and oppressed. And it's so unnatural to be oppressed. And I've shown that in many classes when I talk about what is racism. It's this confusion, this thing that's unfair, this thing that's put upon you, that's not natural. I think of the same with a ballet like Menon, where the title character, I saw it played by Tamara Rojo out of Royal Ballet years ago, of the vast sexualization and sexism that she experienced from lots of people, including her brother who used her. And so it's ballets like this and ballets like something like South African Suite from Dance Suite of Harlem's rep. I feel, as I think we've kind of all been touching on, more human as I watch and rewatch these ballets and see a reflection of life for what it is, as well as a reflection of hope for what life could be.
When I think about the long-term effects, I think of this phrase that the Zapatistas have. The Zapatistas are an indigenous collective in Mexico. They work towards resurgence of their land, of their people, of their knowledges. But one of the things that they say is that we want a world where many worlds fit. And I think that that's particularly important for us. I mean, even our panel, right? We're very diverse, and yet there are places where we overlap. So how do we cultivate a world where many worlds exist? And I think that art is one way to go about doing that. In order to get there, I think we have to cultivate a radical imagination. But I think it starts at a very young age. And so I think about my daughter. I just became a new mom, and how I can cultivate her to be imaginative. She already is curious and exploring so much. But when we look at our K-12 system of education in the United States, we quickly suppress that radical imagination. And we start dictating, okay, this student is a great visual artist. This person has rhythm. This person does not. And we start to discipline the body. And so part of, I think, the work we need to do in order to see the long-term benefits of art is to unlearn that social conditioning that has disciplined us outside of our aesthetic contribution to the world. Part of our responsibility to the next generation is to help them maintain their radical imagination, because that's going to be how we get out of this mess of white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. We have to think about different ways of being.
So I also have a daughter. She'll be 2 next month. I've been very deliberate about the arts with her and avoided teaching things like the ABC or even counting, even though she's super brilliant and she just does it herself. But giving her crayons and, just anything for her to express herself has been really, really important to me. And reminding her or teaching her that to make a mark is to express herself. And so instead of telling her to draw or to paint, I tell her, express yourself, right? And she just does water paintings or whatever she's doing. But I think it's really important for me as a Chicana, as someone who is going to be bringing up a daughter in a very different class system that I was brought up in, to foster that. And I have those tools available to me and the knowledge, right, that the arts are important, unlike my immigrant parents who were just trying to survive. The benefit of that will be, as Jessica says, like a more maybe just world in which more worlds can fit into one, right? Where the child recognizes, I express myself, but this expression is not the only expression, right? Mommy's going to have another expression. Someone else will have a different expression. And it's a fitting together of all the expressions, right? That I think will help us.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with everyone, actually. To the question, what long-term effects will we see, if we really focus on the arts? We will see much more whole human beings, mentally and emotionally and spiritually. In a nutshell, I believe that it will create society with much more well-adjusted, whole, healthy people. And that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much to each of you for coming and engaging in this conversation, for bringing your areas of expertise, your areas of passion into this conversation. I very much hope that we can re-explore this conversation. I think there's so much that we didn't touch on, so maybe today will be the first of several. But until we can meet again, I just want to say thank you so much to each of you.